alaikum and welcome to the Oasis Focus and Finance Show. I'm your host Shafiq Morton, and as always it's great to be with you. In today's show we're going to be having a look at two things. First of all, the medium-term budget that was delivered recently in Parliament by Finance Minister Tutu Mboweni, and secondly, in the second half of the show we're going to be having a look at the 3 R's: retirement, retrenchment and resignation. But joining me in studio for the first half of the show are Adnan Hardien and Shehzaad Hariff. Gentlemen, assalamu alaikum and welcome.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Adnan, let's start off with you. Medium-term budget was delivered in Parliament, quite shocking to many people, too much expenditure, too little tax collection, and it just went on a litany of woes. The question we have to ask, where do we go from here and why all this anxiety?
Yes, Shafiq, I think certainly the reaction to the outcome was quite negative. If we look at the hard numbers that were presented, it was broadly in line with what we were expecting. But I think that what caused the anxiety and caught most people by surprise was the realization that the bulk of the deterioration actually wasn't due to Eskom. Now, certainly additional spending to fund Eskom had contributed and contributed significantly. But the main reason for the deterioration was actually an underperformance on the revenue side, and more worrying, the expectation that this is likely to continue. In terms of the figures, for the current fiscal year, I think the revenue under collection will amount to more than 30 billion, whereas on the expenditure side, they're spending more than 25 billion. And a big portion of that over expenditure is Eskom. But revenue accounts for about 2/3 of the underperformance. And more worrying is the expectation that that will increase over time.
Now, I think the next logical question is why the underperformance? I think most South Africans are asking that question.
Correct. Now, revenue collections is ultimately a function of only two things. One is the ability to collect taxes, and the other is the base from which one is collecting it from. Now, in terms of the collection of taxes, if we actually look at the tax rates that we as South Africans actually face, then they are already quite high. If we just look at, for example, the taxes on income and profits, it currently amounts to around 15% of GDP, whereas for your largest economies, the so-called OECD bloc, that ratio is closer to 11.3%. And in fact, the only countries that are paying higher ratios are your Northern European countries, including many of the Scandinavian countries, and many of them have huge social welfare programs. So the people at National Treasury realizes that your tax rates are those things that if you push it too hard, you actually end up collecting less because of evasion and avoidance. And the only real way of increasing your tax rate is to grow the economy. And unfortunately, on that front, the news has been quite negative. Whereas previously, National Treasury were looking for sustainable growth in this economy of around about 2.5% to 3%. They now think that it's more likely to be between 1.5% and 2% at a stretch. So less growth means less revenue that can be collected.
Shehzaad, let's get on to the other topic, and that was Moody's. Everybody gets moody when they hear about Moody's. And there was a lot of stress at the time that we might be put into junk status. We weren't put into junk status, but just explain to us this whole ratings agency scenario.
Okay, so first let's try to understand what are credit agencies and what are their roles, right? So Moody's is one of the largest. There's 3 main players in that space, and you have S&P and then Fitch. So basically what they do is they rate the quality of the debt, of borrowers, what are they issuing. So basically they just come up with a rating which is based on the ability of that government or corporates to see whether they are able to actually repay their debt timeously and whenever that debt is maturing. So if we take an example, like just us as individual, if we go to the bank, what happens is they will look at our sources of income, what's our existing debt, and like whether we are able to actually repay those. And they come up eventually with a credit profile for the company. We get a score. Everyone is worried about that score, so we get a score. They actually come up with a rate of borrowing, so the cost of borrowing. So if you have a high score, basically the rate will be higher, so you'll have to pay more interest on the debt that you're taking. But if it's low, then you have some flexibility there. So now rating agencies, so they have quite a significant scale, right? So they have the investment grade and the sub-investment grade, and then the junk. Like junk is part of the sub-investment grade. So on the high end, the first one, the very high investment grade, that's your triple A's, and then it ends up with triple B minus. But for Moody's, so all three rating agencies have different scales. So for Moody's, it's they end up with Baa3. So we currently on Baa3, and Moody's is actually the only one that still kept South Africa as a investment grade, and also that's at the lowest level, being the Baa3. So what would a downgrade be? So if we move one notch down, so that's what everyone was really worried about, then we would go to sub-investment grade. But normally, it doesn't just happen like that. So you have two aspects to the rating. So they come up with the rating first, and then there's an outlook component to it. So the outlook basically ranges from positive, stable to negative. So let's say we were in a stable outlook, right? So let's say in a best case, we were improving, debt was reducing. So they would have moved us first to a positive outlook, right? And then in the next review, they would just move up. Like if we continuing to do better, they would improve our credit rating. But on 1st November, what happened is, so following the medium-term budget, where we actually see that the country's debt is not stabilizing, and that's mainly because, like you did allude to it with regards to Eskom, although it's not one of the main components, but it's driving the debt higher. So just for the year, so for 2019, so the debt is expected to become at 60.8% of GDP, and it will increase further to 71%. So like 10% increase in just 3 years in 2022. And eventually, when you're in 8 years' time, in 2027, it's coming up to 80.9%. So that's a lot, right? And it was hard to see that. So even though they came out and say that we're not downgrading you, but we need to put you on a negative watch. You don't have a positive outlook at the moment, it's negative. And the implications really, so if I can just touch briefly on what can happen, let's say in the next review, they come and say like, okay, the debt is not improving. So they are forced to move Moody's not Moody's, but SA into the sub-investment grade. So besides the fact that borrowing cost is going to increase, so we're going to pay higher rate for borrowing, so a higher interest cost, there's an impact on the bond market, the capital markets. Basically, there's a risk of outflow, that is foreign money leaving South Africa. So we have the World Government Bond Index, and we're currently part of that bond. So you can see South African bonds in that index. And if ever we move down to sub-investment grade, so we won't form part of that, right? And we estimate like an outflow of around 5 to 7 billion USD that will flow out of the country as a direct result of a downgrade. So that's basically why everyone is quite apprehensive of a downgrade, and that's why it's like such a big story. Many viewers are actually thinking, so what does that mean to us? So we just sitting at home, and like the rating is the country's rating that is being downgraded, but it actually has some implication on us as well. So what happened is, you have the country rating, which is South Africa, so we'll have the country, but then all the companies also have a rating. So that means that for a private company, for example, when they're going to borrow debt now, their rating has been like one notch down, or like their outlook negative, and it means that they need to pay higher in terms of their debt, which means less profit, less investment, and eventually less job because they can't invest. They need to invest to pay their debt, basically.
So Adnan, I mean, the cloud is dark. Is there any silver in this cloud? Is there any silver lining in this cloud? Can we find something?
Of course we can. Look, we have to say that two things have become clear since the election of President Ramaphosa. One is the realization that the scale of the devastation that has been wrought over the last like 10 years.
The devil we know.
Correct. Is enormous. It really is enormous. And redoing that, unfortunately, will take time. But I remind some of my colleagues that not too long ago, over the period 2004 to 2007, this economy was averaging growth of around 5%. Over a shorter period within that, we were running fiscal surpluses, which means government was spending less than what it was collecting. But for us to have gotten there actually took a long decade of pretty hard work. And that is where we are at the moment. A lot of the changes are necessary, but if we stick it through, I certainly believe that we will reap the benefits.
Shehzaad and Adnan, Shukran, thanks for chatting to us about the medium-term budget. And yes, indeed, a little silver lining in the cloud. That's all for the first part of the show. Don't go away, because when we come back, we're going to be talking about the 3 R's: retirement, retrenchment, and resignation. Welcome to the second half of today's Oasis Focus and Finance show, in which we talk about the 3 R's: retirement, retrenchment, and resignation. As we know, many of our bigger companies in this particular climate are offering retrenchment, early retirement, and some people are even resigning. But to help us through all of this, from Oasis is Ebrahim Rawoot. Ebrahim, assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam, Shafiq. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. And I'm sure you're very happy after the Springboks.
Oh, certainly. We can't complain about that. I think, the result is fitting to what has been a good World Cup for the Springboks. And I think, we just need to bask in the glory that we are world champions. I think it's a good indication.
Yeah, and the Beast has just retired and is going to be listening to us today when we talk about retirement.
Yes, certainly. And I'll be contacting him quite soon.
Good. Now, let's say I face one of these scenarios, retirement or retrenchment. What are the things that I should do and I shouldn't do?
I think, Shafiq, the important thing is that, when you're faced with these challenges, first sit down, seek sound financial advice from a registered financial advisor that's going to guide you, he's going to hold your hand, and he's going to show you that, it's not all doom and gloom. I think that's the first starting point. As you mentioned, many companies have been going through a very vigorous restructuring campaign, and it's across all the sectors, whether it is the financial services industry, whether it's the construction sector, the manufacturing sector. All these sectors have been contributing to the retrenchment campaign. And what is happening is you, as a member of a retirement fund, whether you've had 10 years, 20 years, or even 30 years of accumulated retirement savings, what you shouldn't be doing is altering your retirement goals. Because remember, I'm working for a company. My goal is to ensure that I retire comfortably. But when you are faced with these challenges, and those challenges could be, the company's downscaling, and hence I'm going to be offered a retrenchment package, or, the work position is not that great and I want to resign, or the company is offering an early voluntary retirement package for me. Whichever way it is, sit down, don't just sign any documents, sit with HR, let them give you the guidance, let them give you the options, but then go back to your financial advisor that should hold your hand in order to identify these type of challenges that you might be facing.
So what are the options, particularly in terms of, let's say, for example, retrenchment?
I think, it's important because, when you are retrenched, you have to look at, first of all, the rules of the company and what that company is going to be offering you. And, I've been exposed to 1 or 2 examples where, where a particular state-owned enterprise was going through a restructuring. And for any individual below the age of 50, they were offering voluntary separation packages. And then for those over the age of 50, they were offering voluntary early retirement packages. So I think it's important because, it is you being specifically bound by certain rules, and those are rules that you obviously need to follow. If you look at, a person that is being offered a retrenchment package, that retrenchment package is made up of a couple of components. I think the first one is your separation package, and that is your, or more specifically, your severance package. This is based on a formula, again, company specific, where it says we will grant you 1 week's remuneration for every completed year of service that you've been with the company. So naturally, if you've been longer with the company, there's a bigger severance package. Then there's also your notice pay that will be granted to you. There's perhaps outstanding leave pay that you need, and then also your bonus. So that is in the case of a person that's being offered a severance package. But now you have someone that is maybe being offered a voluntary early retirement package. So the same applies, but now they might just sweeten the deal a little bit, and they'll offer you maybe a insurance-based product like, we'll allow you to stay on the medical aid. We will continue to contribute a certain portion. So these are little, opportunities that's been granted to you, but don't just be sold by the one opportunity. Look at the overall picture, look at the numbers, and say to yourself, well, how am I going to balance, first of all, being able to ensure that I still maintain a reasonable retirement that's going to be comfortable. I'm not going to rely on the state for financial support. I'm not going to rely on the family for financial support. I want to be financially independent. So, you have to look at the two options. The one is my package, and I think that's important. But then is also the more important aspect, and that is your retirement. Whether it's your pension fund or whether it's your provident fund. What do you do with that? Now, unfortunately, people run for the hills and they tell the human resource and the administrator, pay me out my pension scheme. And, you don't realize that you're contributing a lot more to the tax system, and all of a sudden you're sitting with this cash in your bank and you feel there's no problems in the world. But Shafiq, too much money in the bank account tend to find a little bit of feet, and before you know it, the feet start galloping, and a year later you've actually depleted all your cash savings. And this is what we as individuals needs to eliminate. We shouldn't fall into that trap of just tapping into our retirement savings. And I think, it's always best to maybe use it as an example, to be able to explain to people out there the power of investing over the long term. So if you take a person, if you take a person that's, let's say, 24 years of age, he's been working for a period of, let's say, 6 years. Naturally, a young person would find employment elsewhere. But during that 6 years, he's accumulated, say, 250,000 Rand in a pension fund. He meets a good financial advisor, and that financial advisor tells him, your target date is 65. Don't change 65. So now you've got this opportunity to invest this 250,000 Rand for a period of 35 years. Assume you invested in a preservation fund, and it's giving you an assumed 8% return. For 35 years, 8% return compounded year in, year out, that 250,000 Rand grows to 3.7 million Rand. That's substantial. But at the age of 30, he moves on to new employment, and he works for another period of, let's say, 15 years. During that period, he accumulates another 1.2 million Rand. He still keeps in contact with this good financial advisor that reminds him, you need to preserve, and he goes and he preserves for another 20 years. What does he do? That 1.2 million, again in a preservation fund, same 8% return, all of a sudden grows to 5.5 million Rand. Now look at the effect that it's having. I mean, all of a sudden these, what might sound like a small amount, now becomes substantial 10, 20, 30 years down the line. He then finds another job, and he then works for another 15 years. And this is up until, say, 60, where unfortunately he becomes retrenched. But during that period of 15 years, he's accumulated another 1.8 million. He says to himself, well, I've received my package, so I'm going to try and live with my package for the next 5 years. And again, I repeat the exercise and I preserve for another 5 years. That 1.8 million then grows to 2.6 million. For a period of 35 years, having preserved his pension 3 times, and he's only invested 3.2 million Rand of capital, his end result is all of a sudden just shy of 12 million Rand. And that is the power of investing over the long term, the power of compounding, the power of ensuring that I will remain financially independent when it counts most, and that is going to be at retirement. If you just take that same example and you throw it over to a person that at age 30, he decides, I'm going to cash in my pension fund. So he takes his 250, pays the taxes, and then he moves on and he just keeps on cashing, but only realizes that he needs to preserve at a late age of, say, 40. All of a sudden, you can imagine he's lost out on the time value of money, and he's only going to probably sit with maybe 30, 40% of what this individual, smart, astute, has been able to achieve over a period of 35 years.
Sort of a two-pronged question to end off. The first one, very quickly, the transfer of a preservation fund, is it only applicable to the retrenchment process? And then the second part of the question, the need for, we always hear a qualified financial advisor, just to emphasize on that particular point to close off.
Yeah, maybe very quickly, the first answer is yes, you can, and you can transfer from preservation to preservation. And again, seek sound financial advice in order to ensure that I am moving from one product to another that's going to be to my benefit. But, when you come back to that sound financial advice, and we speak about it in every single interview, if you have a heart problem, you're not going to speak to any other person except a cardiologist
or
a heart surgeon. Certainly not. If you have a problem with your engine, you're going to speak to an approved motor mechanic. Similarly, when you speak to a financial advisor, he's giving you advice on your financial affairs. He's the one that's going to take that blank piece of page and he's going to make that picture look so clear to you to ensure that you are going to be able to achieve what you've set out when you started earning your first salary. And I think, really just to end off, it's important that you seek sound financial advice. There's many opportunities out there. Speak to us. We will guide you. We don't charge a fee for financial advice in the sense that you set up an appointment with me. We're there to guide you. We're there to hold your hand. And I think that's what people need to understand, the comfort you're going to get when you speak to an Oasis financial advisor.
Ebrahim, shukran.
Thank you.
And that concludes today's edition of the Oasis Focus and Finance Show, during which we discussed the medium-term budget and the triple R, resignation, retirement, and retrenchment. Special thanks to our guests, Adnan Hardien, Shehzaad Hariff, and Ebrahim Rawoot. Should you wish to watch this or any of our other shows, you can log in to the Oasis Crescent YouTube channel or catch us on LinkedIn. Should you wish to call us, 0860 100 786 or email info@oasiscrescent.com. Until next time, I'm your host, Shafiq Morton. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.